Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. As you can imagine, it's a long way from the Hutong to Park Avenue. But I'll do my best here to explain a little bit about the book that I wrote and also what's happening in Beijing, both prior to the Olympics and what's been happening since. I'm going to show you 50 photographs. Many of them were taken by Mark Leong of National Geographic of the neighborhood. It'll go rather quickly, actually. I'll touch on a number of topics. It'll take about 45 minutes. And then I'll open it up. I'll talk to Orville, and I'll welcome your questions as well. Let me see if I got my technology right here. Nope, I don't. I never intended to go to China. I should start with that in the beginning as we look at this map of old Beijing. I grew up in Minnesota in an area outside of Minneapolis that wasn't even a suburb. I mean, we had well water and oil heat, and it was all corn farms around us. And I went to university at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I was going to be a Spanish teacher. Now, in 1995, I applied to join the Peace Corps because I thought, I could go to Latin America with the Peace Corps. And I put in my application with the Peace Corps, and they called back during my student teaching, and they said, we want to send you to Sri Lanka. And I said, well, I'm a Spanish speaker. I don't really want to go to Sri Lanka. And they said, okay, we'll call you back. They called back a few days later, and they said, how about Malawi? And I said, well, Malawi's in Africa. They don't speak Spanish. I don't really want to go to Malawi. They called back 2 days later. They said, how about Vladivostok? I said, I don't want to go to Vladivostok. And we kept going down the list, and the countries kept getting further and further away from Spanish-speaking ones. And it was finally on the 8th phone call in 1995 when Peace Corps called me, and they said, we're going to send you to China. And I said, you're kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. I'm a Spanish speaker. I didn't even know that Peace Corps was in China. And they said, well, officially you're not Peace Corps. You're the U.S.-China Friendship Volunteers, because Mao Zedong had slandered the Peace Corps name as, being a puppet agency of the CIA in the 60s and 70s. So we're not officially Peace Corps. So I ended up going to China in 1995 without speaking a word of Chinese. I couldn't even use chopsticks. And I ended up in Sichuan province in the far southwest of the country. The school had no idea what to do with me, and so they said, do you play basketball? And I said, sure. And they said, well, you're our starting center. So for 2 years in Sichuan, I was a starting center for a college basketball team and got to travel around the province. And I also trained teachers and whatnot. But as many of you know, if you've studied Chinese, once you start learning the language, it's hard to let go of it, and it's hard to leave. So when I moved to Beijing in 1997, I was living way up here where this white arrow is. I was living in the northwest suburbs, and I was teaching. And, I'd come into the city center here. Can you tell me how to get a red light on this thing? Gotcha. Okay. So I was living out here, and I would come into the city center. This is the Forbidden City right here. This is Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound. This is Tiananmen Square down here. This is the Temple of Heaven. I would come into the city frequently. I'd ride my bike or I'd rollerblade or whatnot into town. But you know how it is when you live in a city, you don't really realize things are changing until you visit, say, a favorite restaurant or a favorite neighborhood, and you find that it's all rubble. And I noticed more and more that when I came in from outside the city, starting in 1997, into this historic core, places that I enjoyed a week earlier were now piles of rubble. They were being destroyed. It took me many, many years, actually, to start connecting these dots of rubble, as it were, and start realizing there's a narrative here. And I went to the library, I went to the bookstore, and I looked for a book about the destruction of old Beijing and what was happening, and I couldn't find one. So that's usually a good time to write a book, when the book you want to read doesn't exist. So that's why I started The Last Days of Old Beijing. I'll say quickly here, when you look at this part, this is what we know as Old Beijing. This is the former city wall here that Orville alluded to that was torn down. Now it's a beltway. It's a second ring road, highway, expressway. This area within this old city is 25 square miles. It's about the same size of Manhattan, about half the size of San Francisco. And again, I just found the more and more I came in that these areas here are ostensibly protected, these shaded areas. But you'll notice, if you know Beijing's schematic here, this is the Temple of Heaven. So it's protected, but it's not inhabited. You have to buy a ticket to get into it. This is the Forbidden City. Okay, it counts as protected area, but again, it's uninhabited. And Beijing, when I first moved there in 1997, had about 6,000 hutong, these very narrow lanes that are to Beijing what the canals are to Venice. And over time, they were disappearing at the pace of about 1,000 a year. And so it wasn't until 2005, here's Tiananmen Square right here, that I decided, I hear a lot about, we should save old Beijing, or, oh no, old Beijing is being destroyed. But I thought, what's it like to actually live in one of these hutong? What's it like to actually live in these lanes? And the impetus behind this is I found a book by Le Corbusier who talked about his redesign of Paris in the 1920s. And Le Corbusier said, I am so sick of the Committee to Save Old Paris. They come into the old city and they say, oh, I saw a beautiful old wooden door or a wrought iron railing. And then these people go home to their homes with gardens, with flush toilets, without tuberculosis and whatnot. So again, starting in 2005, I thought, I want to live in the oldest neighborhood in Beijing, like local people do, and see what it's really like. Now, this is Tiananmen Square right here, and this little crescent is Tiananmen, or the front gate. This is a picture from the 1920s. You can see the rickshaws out in front of it. This was burned down during the Boxer Rebellion, this gate, and it was redesigned by a German. And so he added these marble balustrades and these little eyebrows over the windows here, the embrasures. But Tiananmen is one of the last extant gates of this old city wall, and it marked the edge of the imperial city. Okay? And so when I decided to move, I wanted to live outside that gate in a neighborhood called Dajialan, or in Beijing you say Dashilar, which means, here's the characters, Dajialan, big fence or big wicker fence. And this is a neighborhood of hutong, of these very narrow lanes, that even as far back as the 17th century, the emperor said, okay, we're going to install gates on either end of them, and they'll be locked every night to deter thieves. Because when you look at maps from even the 19th century, early 20th century, each of the lanes of Dajialan were named for the things they sold there. You had Curio Street, and Jade Street, and Fur Street, and Porcelain Street, and whatnot. And the reason this came about, Dajialan kind of became the Chinatown of Beijing. So if you remember Beijing history, the last emperor, the last dynasty, wasn't a Han Chinese dynasty. It was a Manchu dynasty. And there was a series of edicts where the emperor said, I want all the good stuff out of my imperial city. I want not only most Han Chinese out, I want restaurants out of the imperial city. I want acrobats out of the imperial city. I want tea houses. I want opium dens. I want brothels. I want hotels. Everything had to move outside of the imperial city. And it moved to this neighborhood, to Dajialan. And so a lot of the things that we think about as being very, very Beijing, Beijing Duck and Beijing Opera and Beijing Acrobats really thrived in this neighborhood. Now, this is courtesy of Google Maps. The thing I liked about it, too, this again is Tiananmen Square. Here's Chairman Mao's mausoleum. Here's the front gate. Dajialan is this half square mile right here. And if you look at, if you've been to Beijing, usually, even Marco Polo marveled at how the city was laid out like a chessboard. Everything over what used to be the wall here in the imperial city, Beijing people still say, go north, go south. They don't say turn left, turn right, because everything was arranged perfectly, to the cardinal directions at 90-degree angles. But the streets outside the imperial wall weren't governed by imperial planning codes. And so you see the streets here are it's this higgly-piggly kind of arrangement where you have diagonal hutong and canals that had been filled in over time. And this is a neighborhood that when you wander in it, you can get lost very easily because hutong double back on one another. One of them is so short, it's the shortest in the city. This lane is only about 6 yards long. Another one of them is the narrowest in the city, and it's only about 18 inches wide. It was meant to prevent thieves from escaping a bank robbery. So I really like the fact that here was a rare piece of Beijing's quilt, as it were, that hadn't been nibbled away at yet. It still had this great layout. The other thing is, Vatican City is a half square mile, and Vatican City has about 750 people living in it. Dajialan's a half square mile and has 57,000 people living in it, most of them in single-story houses. And so it's really one of the densest urban environments in the world as well. Now, just when I moved in 2005, you see these new roads started, bisecting the neighborhood. There's another neighborhood over here I'll talk about. The plans, things were changing. I liked it, too, because it's rare in Beijing, as Orville alluded to. It's very rare that when you live in a neighborhood that you can actually research its history. So much has been wiped away, and built anew, that it's difficult sometimes to go to a city archive, let's say, or go to history books and say, I can imagine what this neighborhood looked like. This is what it looks like today, same street grid from a map in 1920. And then the first map of Beijing, which was in the mid-18th century, The neighborhood was unchanged then even. My house that I ended up living in is right here on this map. And this is the front door.